Welcome to Origin Stories. I'm RD.
I'm Parrot.
We're telling stories behind the digital art revolution
Each week we interview top artists.
and live stream with the community.
Let's go. Today is tomorrow's origin story.
Bryan Brinkman, welcome to Origin Stories.
Hey, Roger. Thanks for having me.
We were just talking about this off recording, but we met in person almost 1 year ago to this very day.
Yes. If I remember right, two buddies of mine in the space, Sam Bruckman and Karin 4D, were like, hey, there's this Times Square NFT thing going on. You got to come into the city and check it out. And this was probably the second time I had been in public post-COVID. And it was my first time meeting like Sam, who I'd collaborated with on async music prior to that. First time seeing him in person. And then I got to see you. It was like Gavin Shapiro, Dave Krugman. I'm spacing on other names, but it was just like all these NFT people just all gathered in Times Square to celebrate this big artifacts rollout you're doing.
And now here we are, 1 year later. It just feels perfect. We didn't plan on doing this exactly 1 year from that, but the fact that we were able to stumble on that is really special. But hey, let's start far prior to that year ago and take us far back as you want to take us, because this is of course about you. Bryan Brinkman, what is your origin story?
Oof. Well, I would say I've been in the computer graphics game since I was very young. But I really got hooked when I was in high school. I was making these short flash cartoons for a website called newgrounds.com, which I think was based out of Philadelphia, actually. And you could make whatever stupid cartoons you wanted, post them on this website. People would give it a star rating and leave comments. And this was like pre-YouTube, but like that kind of feeling of putting something creative out in the world and then having people watch it and respond to it, like immediately got me hooked. And so then from that point on, I was like, okay, well, I want to be a director of animation. I want to make animation. And so from that point on, I started applying to college. I went to school in Philadelphia at the University of the Arts for traditional animation, and I kind of learned experimental animation. And so that started me on this path.
What's the difference between traditional and experimental animation?
Traditional would kind of fall in line with like frame by frame Disney animation or Looney Tunes. Experimental falls into more of like the film festival world, where you tell kind of short form stories and use a bunch of different mediums. Like I love mixed media. I love combining styles. If you look at a lot of my work, it mixes like 2D and 3D. And so that stuff isn't as commercially viable, but you can use it to kind of tell these stories. And even though I think post-COVID, the film festival world has kind of hit a decline, 20 years ago, it was like, that was the path of like independent artist animators. If you didn't want to work for the big corporations, you had to do this festival route. And so I always found that kind of interesting. And you had to learn what I saw in the NFT space as well, is that kind of continuation of it, where you can do these short form storytelling that are kind of universal and international. Because when you're making these short films for festivals, you often don't use dialogue. Because then you can send it out to Russia or China and it can play the same way if you can tell the story visually. And so when I joined like Super Rare 2 years ago, it was kind of that same way, where everyone was making silent GIFs that were short form storytelling of whatever they wanted to talk about.
So you must have felt right at home.
Yeah, no, I there was such a technical limitation back then that you had to be a GIF, had to be under 50 megabytes. And so then you saw all these artists kind of learning how to make really nice loops, so that even if you're only telling 5 seconds a story, it feels like 15 seconds. And so I found that to be such a fun challenge of like creating that seamless, satisfying loop.
All right, let's not get to Super Rare quite yet. Let's stay back a little bit older than the 2 year mark. But take us to 1, 2, 3 stories that you were able to create as you were going through, education, post-education, or even prior to that, when you were just discovering animation. Take us to a couple stories that you created that resonated with you personally, whether that was because you would stumble across something meaningful, you would hit some sort of technical milestone, but what do you remember?
Interesting. So like stories as in stories I created, or just stories of my experience?
Or even, let's throw out the word stories. Let's just say broader animations, right? It could be something that you created that you were just really impressed with the look and feel of it, or whether something had a deeper meaning to it. But what stands out to you? Give us some milestones along the educational journey.
Yeah. So one of the things, a lot of animation, you kind of fall back on comedy. I think that was something I learned early on, was that it's a lot easier to make someone laugh than to make them cry. And so when I made my thesis film, I kind of felt like I was in this comedy world, and I was like, okay, I'm going to try and make a serious, like, sad cartoon. And so I made this film called The Coffee Bird, which was the story of like an old man who finds a bird and tries to raise it up, and unfortunately the bird dies at the end. But I showed it, and I thought it was funny and the absurdity of it all. But when I showed it in a theater, people cried, and that like crushed me. And I was like, I did it. I made someone like feel this emotion, which is really hard to feel, but then it made me feel terrible at the same time.
Oh no.
It's like you're like playing with that emotion, but like that was a big moment for me, where I was like, okay, yeah, I get, like, I get why people strive to hit this emotion, because it's a deeper level of connecting with somebody. You're hitting them in this like moment where they're taking their own experiences and putting it into whatever they're seeing. And I think a lot of that kind of resonates with the stuff I'm still making to this day. And so I thought that was a huge moment, kind of creatively for me, because it showed that I didn't have to like rely on like cheesy jokes and like slapstick humor to get a reaction out of people. Some other interesting stories along the way. I think I did a lot of weird jobs for a lot of fashion and toy commercials and music videos. Some of the most fun I had was doing kind of the music side of things, music videos, because almost everybody in my family is a musician except for me. My father's a drummer, my brother's a guitarist. And so that to me kind of resonated in like, oh, we're all using the same side of our brain, but we're using it differently. But I do think animation and music kind of follow the same rhythmic patterns in a lot of ways. And so I'm trying to think of how long ago it was, but it was probably like 6 or 7 years ago. I got to do a music video for a band called The Good Life. And that was one of the most fun things, because they were just like, do whatever you want. And so I just laid on a bed, closed my eyes, and started listening to the song over and over, and just coming up with like dreamlike imagery. And I got to make a music video of whatever I wanted. And so like, those are kind of interesting things where you stop thinking for a bit and you just let your mind wander. And I think I think I learned a lot from that experience in a positive way, of like, you don't have to necessarily tell strict narratives. You can just make something that is dreamlike and ethereal, and it can, let the audience kind of take what they want from that without having to like explain every step of the way, if that makes sense.
It's really interesting, that process of pulling a dream state together, even if it doesn't have a strict narrative, like still having to pull it together somehow and present it somehow.
Yeah.
What were some components of that music video?
A lot of it was kind of thinking about the lyrics and how they could tie from one to the next. And so with that one, it was a string that kind of threaded each thing. And so it would go from one scene and it would draw a space, and then the string would then go to another space and draw this next thing. And so it's kind of creating these environments, but then having them kind of morph into each other in fun ways. And so that one was all done in this kind of black and white line work style, which I think you can see a correlation to with like my neon work now. And I eventually kind of returned to it when I did a Sesame Street music video a few years later, which is a lot more colorful. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of dreamlike feeling allowed me to kind of escape this narrative animation world, if that makes sense. Because I think that's just the pros of music videos, is that they don't have to be literal at all. They can just be a visual accompaniment.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Now, I definitely have to get my hands on the Sesame Street video to show my daughter.
Yeah. I mean, the song's pretty annoying, but it's fun. It's called what's the name of this song? But that was a fun one, because they came to me and there's like, make whatever you want. And I just got to storyboard for like 4 minutes of crazy Sesame Street visuals. And it was pretty fun. I mean, I'm such a big fan of the Muppets and Jim Henson and all that stuff. So it's just like, that was one of those things where like they came to me and they're like, can you make us a music video in like 3 weeks? I was like, yes, I will figure it out.
So those compressed timeframes, and actually to take that a step further and go to creativity live. I think did you just hit an anniversary, like a 6-year anniversary or something of doing comedy live?
Yeah. I did a show 2 nights ago. It's a show called Picture This. And I've been involved with it for 6 years now. And the concept of the show is a comedian will go up and do stand-up, and then they have a projector or a projection screen behind them. And then I'm standing on the side of the stage, live drawing it digitally, and kind of either drawing the jokes or elevating it or making jokes about them or whatever, but like kind of getting extra laughs in between. And you can kind of create this secondary joke world. And so it's a lot of fun. I've been, for a long time, I was kind of booking it and doing the tech and all that other stuff. And it's been a fun journey. We had to kind of go offline for a little bit during COVID and do it on Zoom. But before that, I got to do it at like the Kennedy Center in DC, which was wild. It's been a wild journey of drawing crude imagery.
I met you and learned about you before I knew that you did that. But then once I understood that you did that, it all made sense to me. I mean, I feel like your presence is so, I don't know, it's just very timely, witty, natural, free flowing, like able to be present in the moment because you do have such rich experience. So it was no surprise to me that you've been doing that for quite some time.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, it's definitely, it puts me in an uncomfortable position as well as the comedian, because with the comedian, they're used to telling, I mean, I hope I'm not spoiling stand-up for people, but most comedians tell the same joke like 1,000 times in a row, and they're very used to the rhythms, and they're very used to when that laugh's going to happen and when it'll end, and when they hit this timing. And again, comedy is also like music. It's very rhythm based, and you start to like learn the songs. When you do a show like this, the laughs hit at a different point, and then they turn around, they look at the drawings and they comment on the drawings, and all of their rhythms thrown off. And so it creates this kind of chaotic moment where they're off their game and I'm a little off, and I'm kind of improving and they're improving, and it's a very fun, weird show. And last one I drew for 2 comedians at the last show, and it was a good show. Sold out. Fun.
Amazing.
It's at Union Hall in Brooklyn if anybody's in the New York area.
I'm coming sometime this next year. I'm coming.
Yeah.
So, okay, get us a little bit closer then to Super Earth. Give us one more marker on that journey before we get to NFTs themselves.
Yeah, so I would say outside of my commercial work, working in television, all that, during my journey between college and where I'm at now, I was doing gallery shows out in LA at a place called Gallery 1988, which focuses more on pop culture art, which is a fancy way of saying like highbrow fan art. So it's like, we're going to do an official Monty Python art gallery show, or we're going to do a Rick and Morty art gallery show, or we're going to do shows about the 1990s. And so then they give you these prompts, and then you get to create whatever you want, and you do these big group shows with a lot of really awesome, talented artists, a lot of which are in the NFT space now. But I not fully knowing what I wanted to do with my art at the time, I loved working within that prompt constraint. And the tricky part for me was, I'm a digital artist, but these are physical shows. And so it was like, how do I translate animation or digital art into a physical form? And the way I did that was I built these 3-dimensional shadow box pieces that kind of utilized animation cell ideas. And so I would create these kind of stacked 3-dimensional displays, print them out on transparency, paint the back, and then there'd be this like, piece of Ash versus the Evil Dead or something. And then I would ship them out to LA. The galleries would take 50%, and then I would never see them ever again. But I did that for probably 8 years as well, up until about last year. And so I enjoyed doing that show. It allowed me to kind of get that gallery feeling, which I think then gave me an understanding of why NFTs were so important for what I needed to do next.
Why are NFTs so important for what you needed to do next?
Well, one, it allowed me to put my artwork in motion. Mm-hmm. It allowed me to not have to ship it out to LA, and it didn't take 50%. And it gave me secondary royalties. Like all of those were like, oh, these are answering all the things I've always struggled with, which is, as a digital artist, I was putting my artwork on every social platform that came out year after year, whether it was Tumblr or Instagram or, Peach, I think was one. There's so many. And every time one comes out, you go, okay, I gotta see if this is gonna be the platform that elevates artists. And then none of them really do. The algorithms fight it, or Tumblr just kind of dissolved into weirdness. But looking for a place where you can put your art, that you get that feedback that I was getting when I was in high school in Newgrounds, it's always been on my journey of like, where will the next thing be? And so an artist I collect physical work of, Killer Acid, was sharing his work on Super Rare, and that's how I discovered it. And I was like, what is this? What are people paying for here? What's Ethereum? I was very out of the loop. But I spent like a month kind of digging through Super Rare, seeing what people were making, trying to learn about what NFTs were. And then I applied in January 2020. I got on and I minted my first NFT in February 2020.
So when you were doing your month of due diligence, right? You saw Killer Acid. This is interesting. What's going on here? What was a revelation or two that you came to yourself during that month as you were exploring what is Ethereum? How is this tying in? What is Super Rare? What did you learn and what was relevant to you?
Well, learning how smart contracts worked and how like royalties played in was a big part of it. Kind of understanding that this new platform was giving digital art of validity in a way that I wasn't able to see in the past, because most artists were kind of using Kickstarter or Patreon or all these other things that would kind of pay them a subscription for content. And this was like, oh, you don't need to, you're no longer being, with Kickstarter and Patreon, you're basically the employee of all these people that are paying you, and you're expected to give them X amount of things on a regular basis or rewards for funding you or something. I was like, this new thing doesn't require that. Once they buy it, that's their, that's on them to do what they want with, and they're just buying your art. And so I thought that, to me, was a very big like paradigm shift in how artists were trying to raise money to fund their artwork outside of doing like commissions. And so to me, that part like kind of made my brain switch. And then even after I got on Super, I was still very much learning. And I think you can see in my pieces when I started to learn about certain things. Like one of my early Super Rare pieces is called Flip, and it's about like the diamond flipping out of a phone. Like that was when I started to understand the flipping culture of the space. Mm-hmm. Because at that time I was like, oh, people are buying art. I wasn't really thinking about that aspect yet, because it really wasn't that prevalent yet. And so you can kind of see like my Super Rare pieces, especially in that first year, are kind of a diary of me understanding like this piece is about when I learned how gas worked and why it did what it did and why it's going up. And so it's kind of like, that was my journal of learning. So yeah, I think to me, I think like most artists, that idea of secondary royalty and having long-term ownership of your art even though you're selling it to other people. That was what really clicked. And I was like, this is unlike anything I've seen, coming from an industry where, there is no union for animation in New York or motion graphics or any of that stuff. Like, there's not a lot of long-term thinking in those industries. And to see art being built in a way that thought about the long-term value was so cool.
So when you start to understand these things to the point that you're now ready to put yourself out there, put yourself on the platform, how do you decide what to put first?
Yeah, well, that month of looking was also a month of debating the video submission, which is like the hardest thing for artists to do, because I think most artists, especially digitally based artists, are probably introverted by nature. We're sitting at computers all the time. So making a video of yourself talking about yourself is like one of the hardest things for artists to do. But I understand why Super Rare did it, but I also know it's like very difficult for artists to put themselves out there like that. And so I had made 3 examples. My first one, Explode, being one of those 3. And then the 2 other, I think once I got on the site, I scrapped, because I was like, this, even though I had those ready to go, I was like, no, I'm gonna throw those out. But that was kind of like, I have my video somewhere. I could show it to you some other time, but it's like, hi, I'm Bryan. I work at these shows and I have my art in these galleries, and I want to make art like this. And I was like having all these like pop-up visuals and stuff. But I really kind of, there wasn't a lot of like heavy stress at the time, because it was before Beeple and all that craziness in the space. And so I wanted to just dive in and play around and see what was possible. And it kind of just went from that point on.
The before Beeple era.
Yeah.
It's like before Beeple part 1 and before Beeple part 2.
Yeah. No, I think even I would say, before Beeple, there was like, Fuck Render was a big turning point in the space, because that was when I joined the space. There was very little 3D art. It was mostly kind of glitchy, grungy stuff. When I joined, part of what I did, when I talked about that month of looking, I looked at the stuff and I was like, oh, it's a lot of this kind of Rob Ness, Coldy, X-Copy, that all has this kind of grungy vibe to it, which I think is really cool. But that's why when I joined, I kind of went that colorful animation route, because I was like, I don't see a lot of 2D animation in the space. I don't see a lot of colorful stuff. I think Joy was kind of off on his own outside of Super Rare, but Joy was probably the prototype before me in that sense. But yeah, a lot of it was kind of like art about crypto, grunginess. And then when Fuck Render joined, you really started to see all of these Instagram artists that were like in that 3D world all kind of swooped in with that, because they saw it as well. That was like 6 months later after I joined.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that was, I think he came on Super Rare October, if I'm not mistaken. Somewhere like give or take 1 month, like right in that window. And then Nifty soon after. And
then I think, Beeple was shortly after that, because he saw they were all part of that Instagram 3D world. Yep. Which that was a huge turning point in the space, because that really like that upped the artist number by like 3 times very quickly.
Yeah, it did all start to happen super fast, didn't it?
Yeah.
So so Super Rare. So you decide, okay, submission video in. You have 3 artworks in there. Explode ends up being the one. The other 2 are scrapped. And Explode goes live. What are your expectations at that point? What are you seeing at that time, and how are you thinking it will go?
I mean, I had pretty low expectations, because I wasn't sure like how many people were buying or anything. But I was trying to learn from the other people in the space, whether it was like Sarah Zucker or Coldy. And so I tried doing what I thought was the Coldy method, which is like, I'm going to put this out, and then in 24 hours, I'll close it. Whoever wins, wins, which wasn't exactly the Coldy method, but I kind of what I determined from it. Later, I understood that added 24 hours. But I was doing that for the first few drops where I was just like, here it is. It's available for 24 hours, bid and get it. Later, I learned you got to be better about giving people a heads up about when that happens. And then you have to start giving like a teaser image. That took like 4 or 5 drops before I started making like promotional teasers, like this is coming out on Thursday. And most of the time, I think probably to my disadvantage, I was working full time, and so I felt guilty promoting and selling things during the week. So I was doing it all on the weekends, which is also probably the worst time to be selling stuff. But yeah, I think early on, my first piece sold to Jimmy.eth, who was a troublemaker, to say the least, at the time. I think it was coming right out of like NFT NYC where you fought with everybody. But he was also like very strong-willed and had a lot of opinions that educated me a lot on like on-chain art and the history of crypto. And so he was a great first collector to have and follow. And then I think the next one went to Whale Shark, and the two of them kind of bid against each other back and forth on my first like 5 or 6 pieces. They were both fans of it. And so the two of them, I think, were really great first collectors to have because they were both thinking so much bigger than most people in the space at the time. And so, yeah, Whale Shark kind of saw his collection as a way of kind of building a community around it. And Jimmy started building all sorts of crazy stuff, which we now see as like VFriends and all this other stuff. So he was thinking about how to scale. And so, yeah, having them early on was a huge inspiration.
That's a heck of a 1-2 punch on the front end of your journey.
Yeah, for sure. So I got lucky. I got very lucky in that sense that I had right off the bat two great collectors that were there to scoop up a lot of my early stuff. And none of that stuff was, at the time, it's all relative. I think my first piece sold for $200, which now seems like nothing. But at the time, I was comparing it to my gallery shows. And my gallery shows, I was selling one-of-one pieces for $350. Cost me $50 to ship it out there, and the gallery took 150 of it. So I was making $150 on each one-of-one I was selling. And to sell this first GIF for $200, I was like, this is way better because it's less physical work, less shipping, and I'm making more money this way.
And there's another chapter of that story, and maybe it's a good time to skip ahead because that first artwork did not end there.
That's true. That one, I guess it was last October. I might be messing up the date, but it got relisted then at Sotheby's as a part of the digitally native 1.2 sale. And then that one resold to Pranksy, who was also an early part of my journey. I would say like a couple months into joining the space, I collaborated with him on a thing called Pranksy Land, which was an early metaverse real estate artist. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like a district of custom builds that artists were able to do as a collaboration with like Pranksy, because Pranksy had all the land, and he's like, if anybody wants to build anything, build it on my stuff.
But it was amazing to see. I remember that Sotheby's, I guess, collector first, release, however we want to frame it. But I remember that happening, and I remember that almost, Brian, I haven't told you this, but that was almost the moment where maybe our paths crossed from a collection standpoint, because I had my eye on Explode. And of course, it ended up doing quite well. I think it was one of the better performing artworks in the entire like Sotheby's collector first release. But that was where I guess Pranksy purchased it from Jimmy, right?
Yeah. No, that was a weird one, because it was a slow start to that, and then it ramped up right at the very end.
Yep. And that was the moment. Sometimes it's tricky in this space. Sometimes you think you have a shot at something. You're like, oh, is the world sleeping on this right now? And then as those last few minutes tick off, you're like, no, the world wasn't sleeping on it.
Yeah, I think Pranksy wasn't sleeping. He picked up a lot of really good pieces in that show. I think he makes a lot of long-term bets, and I think they usually pay off. But that was such a cool show. I mean, a lot of people in this space kind of frown at the traditional auction houses, whether it's because of KYC or the hammer fee. But I'm often a lot of artists have come to me since then and said, "Hey, should I do this?" And it's always yes. It's like, even if it undersells what it would have sold on super rare, like there's a huge difference in validation outside of the space. And I often say, like, my grandma doesn't know what Nifty Gateway is, but she knows what Sotheby's is. And it's like, it's important to people that don't care about NFTs. So it's just a different way of looking at it. But you should always, as an artist, you should always do it once. That way it's on your resume, because it's just, it gives you that validation outside the space.
Yeah, you talked about big picture thinking. I think that's pretty good advice, big picture. That way, if more of the mainstream does, continue to turn heads around and understand NFTs better, even if the verbiage is a bit different, having that Sotheby's or Christie's or whatever the auction house is on your resume probably matters a bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a lot of people, I don't think, give enough credit to Christie's. About a year ago did an Art Blocks lot, and a lot of people thought it undersold. But then 3 months later, Art Blocks went on a crazy run because all this institutional money came in. And I think a lot of that is because it was selling at Christie's. And I think, it's always this like, oh, that could have sold for way more, but would it have reached this height later on if it hadn't have sold for a little bit here,
Right. So take us through. So I skipped us all the way ahead because I thought it was relevant, of course, to Explode and the journey that it took. So then it wasn't just about comparing $200 to $150. Then it was also comparing a secondary royalty from the Sotheby sale.
I've been fortunate to see a lot of my secondary sales have eclipsed. Like the royalties I've gotten have often been more than my initial sale, which is really great, because then one, I get a little bit extra, and then two, the people that invested in me early on are seeing kind of life-changing money. Like, it's so cool. I mean, I've had people be like, "Hey, I'm so sorry I sold your one of one, but I bought an engagement ring for my now fiance." And it's like, that's incredible. Like, I would never be mad at you about that. Like, that's so cool. And like, all because they saw me and they trusted in me. So yeah, I think I'm all for that. If I can help make other people's lives better with my art, that is the dream.
Yeah, I love that perspective. So take us from the first sale at Super Rare, and then you continue releasing pieces. You took us through where Jimmy and Whale Shark are in there, or in early. But then you've experimented on a number of different platforms between that time and now. So take us to a couple of different stops.
Yeah, I think the first stop after Super Rare was Rarible. A lot of people don't talk about Rarible anymore, but for a moment, they dropped this Rary token, and all the Super Rare artists started thinking about editions. And so I remember a bunch of people were all kind of putting out these like small editions of 10. And that was a fun way to kind of expand the collector base, kind of sell things at a different rate. And that kind of led me into what my next stop was, which was Nifty Gateway. And how I got on Nifty Gateway is kind of an anomaly compared to most stories. There's an artist named Ikaitsa, I'm sure you're aware of. And he had done a bunch of drops on Nifty, and they came to him and they said, "We want you to curate an artist drop on Nifty Gateway." And so he recommended myself, Mankind, Rhett, and Van's Design, who I also love. And so he was like, "I'm gonna do a Nifty Gateway drop in 2 or 3 weeks. You want to do it?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah." So I just like spent 2 weeks luckily it fell in a hiatus of my day job at the time, which was the Tonight Show, Jimmy Fallon. And I just spent a week straight just like in the weeds trying to figure this out. And what I did was I kind of took he really liked my piece Wired on Super Rare, and he was like, "I love this piece. I would love to see you expand on this." And so I took that and I turned, which is a guy kind of swinging by wires, And so I started to think about like, okay, what are those wires connected to or something? And it's like, I turned it into this kind of cloud world, and I have a piece where I'm on, it's like a sequel piece where before I was um, I made that wired piece during peak lockdown. And so it was all about me being like, I'm stuck at home, I'm stuck on my computer, I'm like wired in, I'm like, this is my life right now. And then cut to 8 months later, I'm swinging on a cloud, and I'm still in the headset, but I'm much more like relaxed. And so that was kind of like the sequel story. And then I built those other pieces out of that world. And so that was my cloudy collection. And so that was my first Nifty drop, which then that collection snowballed into my next creation, which was Nimbuds on Art Blocks, which came out in January of 2021. And so that was me and my buddy Manny, who I worked with at SNL. He really wanted to get into coding, and I was like, this Art Blocks thing is really crazy. I think we could make something really fun. And he's like, I think we could, he's like, we can figure this out as we go. And I was like, okay, well, I looked at Lux Pre and how he had taken his super rare pieces and kind of figured out how to make them generative. And so then I said, okay, well, maybe we can make these generative clouds with wires. And so then that was just us experimenting with what was possible and what we could do with code for a few weeks or a month or so. And then that became that project. And then from there, the same time I was starting to work with Verdigris Ensemble on what would become the Genesis async music piece called Betty's Notebook, which was a programmable piece of music and art that became a physical that showed at NFT NYC last year. And then along the way, I also really got into doing collaborations. I did all sorts of stuff for Digital X, Collective, .gg, Art Vitars, like all these things. I at a certain point, I just became really excited about like collaborating and working with all these different artists. And so, yeah, it starts to snowball or very quickly around January 2021.
And I mean, Nimbuds at the time, I remember it being during the rise of Art Blocks.
Yeah.
And things really ramped up and really took off after that.
Yeah. I think there was a few moments like Lux Pre was a well-known artist outside of it. And then I came in, and that brought in a new wave of collectors that were kind of curious about on-chain generative art, but didn't fully understand it. It was a lot of education back then, trying to explain to people like, oh, I didn't make these in Photoshop. These are all generative live code, like randomized. Like now everyone understands that. Back then it was very like, people like, oh, this art looks so simple. I can't believe people are buying it. It's not, I didn't make this. It's all code. Yeah, so I think I was the 10th Art Blocks project. And then I think a few weeks later was Ringers. Yep. And then that hit a huge wave. And then like a month or two later was Fidenza, and that hit an even huger wave. And by that point, it was like, it was on its own like cycle.
Speaking of resumes, right? You stuck this word in my brain now with the Sotheby's and the auction house talk. But yeah, it's a pretty cool thing to have on your resume to be the 10th Art Blocks project.
Yeah, no, I mean, and a lot of it was like just luck, because I learned about Art Blocks from Nifty Time Matthew. He had showed me, spacing on the name, but it's all the little pie charts, and you can move the mouse back and forth, and they change like the rotation. And so that was
pie slices, right?
Yeah, dynamic slices.
We got there together.
Yeah. And so that was when I was like, oh, these are interactive. This is so crazy. And I didn't understand like squiggles were interactive till like months later, because no one told me. But I was like, whoa, this is really cool. And so that's why if you like look at my Nimbuds, if you can click them and it puts them in a box. And then if you watch them long enough, they blink. And I love that idea of like not just making generative art, but making interactive and animated generative art. And so that part got me really excited. And then I think what I didn't fully grasp at the time was when I made those pieces, I thought of them as, if you remember like Kid Robot toys or like blind box gotcha toys or whatever, you buy a toy in a box, you don't know which one you're going to get. That aspect I really thought was like really cool because I love collecting that kind of stuff. But it borders the line of gambling a little bit. And so we made a point when we did it not to talk about or show any of the special traits beforehand. We didn't want anybody to think there was like rarer ones necessarily, because we didn't want people to like FOMO buy a whole bunch. There was a lot of concern about it selling out way too fast, which it sold out in like 5 minutes, but I wanted to make sure a lot of people were able to get it.
Yeah.
And so I like tried to be very careful about that. What I didn't fully grasp was 3 months later, Bored Apes and Hash Masks and all this stuff really leaning into that aspect. The PFP, the gambling, the rarities. I think I was a little bit more naive back then to think like, oh, we shouldn't play into these impulsive, speculative stuff. And then like a year later, it's like I'm buying into like everything I can to do that.
Look how far we've come, Bryan.
Yeah.
That's great. You dropped a few names, and I think we'd be remiss to at least not do a little bit better than glossing over them, because again, it goes back to that resume word. But you dropped the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, and you also dropped SNL, and you just want to. We can't make it through an entire origin story without pulling.
That's fine.
Back.
Yeah. No, they're huge parts of my journey. Yeah.
Just talking about an amazing stop, and I think even recently on Twitter you showed you're up to 4 Emmys now, something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, they're sitting somewhere in the back here. Yeah, so I think I worked on Fallon for 8 years, something like 1,600 episodes or something. And I worked on SNL on and off for 6 years, and I still theoretically fill in from time to time. I worked on a few episodes this season because it's a fun show to work on, and you just go in on a Saturday and you work your butt off. But I think those shows allowed me to really push my creative palette in a lot of directions, because you are put on the spot to be like, we need a fake cover of a Dr. Seuss novel in an hour. And so you go, okay. And then you draw something real fast. Or they go, we need a visual effect where, the president has googly eye glasses on his face. And then you learn how to do that really fast. And so you have to like constantly be learning on the fly, picking up these tools and getting really fast at it. And that also ties into SNL, which is all done in a single day, essentially. And it's like, how much can you get done? And that to me is why I really enjoyed the NFT space, was that it allowed me to work on stuff for a week or a month. It allowed me to kind of get out of that like very fast pace, never making something look finished, but enough to make it sell the joke. And so I really appreciated all the opportunity to work on those shows. And with SNL, we got to do like that NFT sketch like a year ago, and I got to put some of my own NFTs in there, which was really cool. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting. It's interesting to like see the correlation of what I took from those and brought it into here. Probably some of my marketing is definitely like reminiscence or something like that. But yeah, it's interesting because like to me, that's like old world media, and what we're building here is like this next wave of media.
It's funny you mentioned the word marketing, and also just having a little bit more time to see your art through. If I were to take a step back, one of the things that impresses me the most about, Bryan Brinkman's NFT journey, looking across Super Rare and Nifty Gateway and all your collaborations, it's not true maybe everywhere in every nuance, but I can sit back and I can see, oh, wow, like this influenced this, and this story thread extends to here. And I can almost take one of your strings and start to tie different things together. And I just come away from that of taking that overview look at your NFT trajectory, and I come away just thinking Bryan Brinkman is so smart. Like there is, I think you say you make art and fun, right? You make art and fun, but you do it in such an intellectual way. And yeah, talk about that a little bit. Talk about that macro overview, having that sense of cohesion and narrative that seems to permeate a lot of your artwork.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that goes back to doing the old gallery world stuff.
Mhm.
There was a moment 12 years ago where a buddy of mine who was a curator of gallery shows basically told me, if you want to be in gallery shows, you got to do the same thing over and over and over. They want, if you have a style, they want to sell that style. And if you do a group show, they want you to do what you're known for because that's what sells. And I hated that, even though it's very true. And you'll see the most successful artists in the space hold true to that theme. I kind of went against the grain in that way, where I said, okay, well, if I use the same colors that I used in that very first Explode piece throughout everything, then I can change my style as much as I want. I can do neon, I can do 3D, I can do programmable, whatever. And it all kind of ties. And as you watched my super rare journey, you can see how I started to introduce symbols, whether it's like a light, phone pole or a diamond or a gas tank or something. And then those can start to become a storyline and other things. And I wanted to start basically from scratch when I joined. Like I didn't want to bring my movie, TV show artwork into this space. I wanted to kind of start fresh. And that was kind of that explosion of color was me saying, okay, this is the start of this new thing. And then those clouds from that explosion became a whole thing. The colors became a whole thing, and kind of everything builds off that initial thread. And so I like how you framed it as, there's a thread between all of them, because it really is. A lot of the pieces are about that kind of connection of people, of art, of everything. And that's my whole Wires is like built on that thesis of connection.
And you even take it to, I think the collection that blew me away was Tragic Pop on Nifty Gateway a few months ago. And you even look at components of that and you see heart. It gives me Explode vibes and flashbacks as the little mini hearts, explode and become broken hearts and then whole hearts again. You look at the eye and it has the cloud components to it, and some of the wires behind it, and even all the pieces within Tragic Pop come together to make the special piece. So it wasn't a surprise per se, but it was, if you collected all of the pieces, they come together to make a whole. I think it's just so fascinating how you do that.
Thanks. Yeah, and that piece kind of touched on the bigger idea that I think I wasn't hammering enough throughout my work, because a lot of people would come and say, oh, your work is so fun and happy and all that. And it's like, well, not really. It's visually fun and happy, but almost all of them are kind of tying into this kind of psychology of being an artist or being involved in the space, and the ups and the downs of it. And whether it's, like the one we talked about earlier with the Wired, like that was about me being completely isolated and down in the dumps. And even though it's like a very fun and goofy thing, and it's like the Async music piece, which is about a woman hearing Amelia Earhart's distress calls and dying, but it's a beautiful piece with like taking her like kind of French women art and kind of turning that into this beautiful scenic piece that I like to draw people in. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with college. You can make this kind of cute animation about a bird and make it fun and happy, and then you hit them at the end with that tragedy, and then you get that real emotion because you brought them in to that moment of vulnerability. And so I think that a lot of my artwork kind of ties into that idea of bringing people in with the fun, happy, candy coated niceness, and then letting them learn about what's really going on with it. And so I think Tragic Pop really kind of tied that 2 years of work together in a fun way.
Yeah, it's just so smart, because a lot of times people aren't either don't want and or aren't receptive without that type of a
Yeah.
coding. You know?
And if they don't want to dive that deep in, it's still a very fun, pretty piece to put on your wall.
Exactly. Exactly. Bryan, you ready to play a lightning round?
Sure.
Let's do it. You know the drill. We're going to throw some topics at you. Hot takes. You're so good at them. I feel like this is ready. No pressure, by the way. No pressure whatsoever. But this is right up your alley. Couple words, sentence. But if you want to hit timeout, break all the rules and go on a complete tangent, you're welcome to do that too.
Okay.
All right. Here we go. First thing that comes to mind when I say NFTs.
Divisiveness. No. No, I think yeah, I see it as the future. A lot of times when I left Fallon a year ago, I told them and I said, NFTs are the new app store. Every company is going to reach out to artists and say, I want to be on this platform. How can I get on this platform? And I don't think people fully understand that aspect of the space yet, which is that this is the new creative medium for everyone, not just artists, but also the art, the technical artists that are working in these industries already, animation, motion graphics. Everybody's going to be working for NFTs.
Boom. That's a good mic drop moment right there. But we plow on. Yeah. All right. First thing that comes to mind when I say the word clouds.
Generative. I also think Rorschach. I don't know. I'm always drawn into this idea of clouds. You can put yourself into the clouds in the same way. When you look in the sky, you say, "Oh, that looks like this shape or this shape." There's something amazing about. We see them every single day. They become an afterthought, but they're a part of our visual landscape on our lives.
Wires.
Connection. Yeah, it's all about whether it's connecting our computers or our mouse or our keyboards, or the connections we make in the space between each other as artists and collectors, or artists to artists. Everything about this space is connection.
Neon.
Cyberpunk. I don't know. I think to me, neon has always been like this appealing vibe. There's an energy to it. It flickers and grows. I really love it.
Super rare.
Ooh. OG 101.
Nifty gateway.
Commercial, mass appeal, bringing in more people.
I'm going after your shirt. All ships.
Oh yeah. Again, connection. Elevating each other.
Let's go with auction houses.
Ooh. Validation, prestige, and long-term. They're not going anywhere.
There you go. You heard it here. You heard it here. The art piece chronologically, so most recently, that made your jaw drop, and stick to the NFT space if possible.
Daniel Arsham's new series he put out 2 days ago. It was like a DeLorean riding through a desert. That made my jaw drop.
I was just going to ask you which one. You went with the DeLorean. I love it.
Yeah, I like the city one was cool, but DeLorean's a cooler car.
Let's go with the artist that recently you had a thought to yourself of, this person needs more eyes on their work. I want either I don't know how they don't have more eyes, or I want to help send them more eyes.
Well, my attention span's short. I bought an Amani LaRussa piece yesterday on Nifty. I think she's incredible, and she's pushing the motion graphics side of the space ahead. So I think I think she's getting more eyes, but I still think she's under the radar in a lot of ways.
That is a name that I've both heard a bunch and have interacted with on Spaces. So I love that. Oftentimes you feel a surge coming, and I have felt a surge recently for Amani.
Yeah.
Which is great to see. So we'll wrap up the lightning round with a little bit more of a question, and obviously feel free to go on as much of a tangent as you want here. But Bryan Brinkman, what is next?
A few things I think is next, and I think I've talked to you about this in the past. I think you're ahead of the curve on it, which is 3D sculptures for the metaverse. I think that is a huge next wave. I think digital wearables for the metaverse is another huge wave. We just saw the biggest NFT sale in history all around a metaverse land deed. So it's very much still the next trajectory. And as an artist and creative, I'm much more bullish on creating assets for the metaverse than buying land in the metaverse, which will continue to change. If you can create art that can live in all of them, then you're like way ahead of the curve.
You're speaking to my heart. You know,
I know.
this.
We've had this conversation. I'm
Yeah.
very much, and it's become more and more true. I think we were talking about it, NFT Now's opening party like 10 months ago, and that was before like On Cyber was a thing. And now we're seeing all of these things kind of come to fruition where you're like, okay, yeah, exactly. This is what we thought would happen. So I think that's definitely a big wave. I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's any other like huge new things. I think gaming, but it's so hard to make good games. They're always so grindy.
Yeah. So much of it's about when, right? So much of it's about when. Even when we were having some of those conversations all that time ago, I remember engaging in some conversations, even like when Artifacts launched with its like leaning into the 3D side of things. I had conversations with a few people who are like, but when, is that is that going to be 3 years from now? Or is that going to be 5 years from now? Or during what wave will it matter? And we'll see, but I do think it matters more now than it did then.
I have a feeling by like, let's say August, fantasy NFTs, as in like fantasy football, are going to be a huge next wave that will bring in that community into NFTs. And I think NFL All Day has a potential. And I think DraftKings might be doing NFTs as well. And I think that'll be a huge next wave, because that's buying NFTs that have a real usage in this other world that's already extremely popular.
And it just makes sense, right? I mean, DraftKings has partnered with Autograph and they've, ushered in some sports NFT. But yeah, I see that those companies is really leaning into utility, like you said, like what can you actually do with this NFT?
Yeah, no, I think it'll be interesting. But I think that could be another Top Shot moment where we bring in millions of new people into this ecosystem.
Could definitely see it. Well, speaking of 3Ds and leaning into, display interoperability, we get to do something pretty fun soon.
Yeah. You want to talk about it? Which one are you referring to?
I feel like you should talk about it. The thing is happening in just a few days.
Okay. You're talking about my drop.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm really excited, speaking of 3D sculptures, that I'm going to get to release an Artifacts piece and a one of one. And we were talking about displays, and we were talking about before you had display behind your piece and your background. I think I'm really excited about this Unreal interactive experience and kind of expanding my space, which again ties into what I've enjoyed doing for the last 2 years, which is like creating virtual experiences around my art. But now I'm going to get to push it forward in a way that I think is going to look mind-blowingly crazier than crypto voxels. So I'm really excited about that. And the sculpture is going to kind of, again, the piece I've created for Artifacts, I don't know if it'll be visual by the time this airs, posted or something, but it kind of ties in a bunch of things I've done in the past 2 years. Again, like you're talking about the strings of my work, and you'll see aspects of super rare pieces, Nifty Gateway pieces, and kind of melding them into this new piece that kind of reflects on me as an artist, but also my journey in this space. So I'm really excited about it.
I can't wait, man. Your art is already so alive. I mean, I think it's the nature of the colors that you use. I think it's the nature of the animations that you use. It's already so alive, and the intellectual aspect of it. But it's so fun thinking about art that is already so alive and thriving, adding a whole nother layer to that in an experience, in this immersive experience. I think that's going to be so much fun. It's something I can't wait to step into, and something fun to unveil for a lot of other folks.
I know, it's going to be really cool. And I love you started doing the rare rooms, which I thought were really cool. And I did a rare room a while back as well, but how you've pushed your interactive experiences forward in the Unreal world has been incredible. Like I spent a lot of time kind of walking around like Jonathan Wolf's skate park and Raph's studio and stuff like that. It's just so fun to like kind of live in these moments, because especially in a world where our Twitter feeds constantly refreshing nonstop, to escape into a moment of Zen like with Josh Pierce's is so valuable, to like fully understand what an artist's vision and what they're doing and their personality.
To throw this right back at you, you know what popped in my head to hear you when you said when you talked about Twitter. What popped in my head was your super rare piece Scroll, which is the two fingers.
Yeah. That, again, another piece that like on the outside is like a fun idea, but on a deeper meaning is kind of tragic, because we're constantly liking and scrolling and it never ends.
The juxtaposition.
It's a treadmill. It's an exercise. But no, I just did a talk in LA at the NFT in America, and I got to do this kind of like TED talk on advice for artists, and it was all about how do you divide your time creatively, and it was a third creative, a third marketing, and then a third connection. And that connection and marketing both fall into that Twitter sphere. So really, like, we're spending like 2/3 of our time on social media, and so it just becomes a huge part of our lives, for better or worse. But I think for better, it's definitely required in this space.
I think overall for better, and then when it becomes for worse, it's a good time to focus on things like filtering and adjusting, maybe adjusting slightly what you're seeing so that you can get back to the for better side.
Yeah, well, I think you, especially in this space, have been an early proponent of like mental health and exercise, and how to kind of use your time effectively to not get burnt out. And I really appreciated, like, I feel like a year ago you were like talking about those kind of ideas before it really became kind of it was never taboo or anything, but it was always kind of like everyone was kind of fighting to the grind to keep up and stuff, and you're like, no, do some exercise in the morning and relax. And it was good. I appreciated that kind of perspective.
I'm glad to hear that, man. And also important to say, it's even from someone like, I come from wellness orientation, that's part of it's a solid part of my background. And even then, like, I've still, even since being an early proponent of it, absolutely, I am not immune from, a month stretch where I look in the mirror and I'm like, not living as well as I might like right now. So it's very, very tough to be fully immersed in the space. And
it's really tough. Yeah. I felt it in December of last year, which you can, if you look at that Nifty drop, you can see it's very frenetic, and it's the tragic pop stuff. It's very much, like I said, my work is a reflection of my journey, and that was me at my most like stressed out and burnt out, because it was like post Art Basel, had some like family tragedies and some other chaos of like trying to get back into the groove and make this piece. And so it's definitely like, if you're not in the right headspace, it'll show in your artwork.
Well said. Yeah, very well said. Bryan, this is a pleasure, man. I'm fond of saying it lately, but for sure has to be an evolution of Origin Stories eventually, called like Milestones, whether it be a live event or whether it be another recorded event. I can't wait. As someone who I perceive as such a true artist, builder, contributor, collector in the space. We didn't even get to talk about your collection really today, which is vast. I can't wait to be back and doing it again.
I would love that. Yeah, I would love to do another talk about just collecting art. I think that would be fun. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of the Artifacts family now.
Can't wait, man. Onward and upward. We'll talk to you soon.